The prairie stretched wide and lonesome beneath a sky bruised with storm. Clouds gathered low, heavy with rain that had not yet broken, and the wind swept across the tall grass in long, sighing waves. Elias Kincaid rode with his head bent, hat pulled low against the sting of dust and grit. His rifle lay across the saddle, though it felt more like a burden of memory than a weapon now. Years of war and marching had worn him hollow, and though he carried scars across his hands and a stiffness in his gait, it was the weight within that bent him lower than the storm ever could. The mare beneath him shifted, ears flicking, and Elias slowed her with a murmur. At the edge of a dried creek bed, half hidden by brush and shadow, he saw movement. For an instant he thought it some wounded animal caught in the snare of storm. But when he dismounted and stepped closer, he saw the truth. A girl. She could not have been more than 16. Barefoot, her dress torn, her dark hair loose and tangled, streaked with mud and blood. Her arm hung stiff at her side, and her gaze, black and unflinching, met his as though daring him to strike. She was Comanche. Elias crouched, careful not to startle her. "You'll die here," he said quietly, though he doubted she understood his tongue. She did not answer, only pulled her knees tighter to her chest, hiding nothing of her defiance. The rattle of distant hooves reached his ears, faint but real. Scouts, settlers, perhaps soldiers, riding the rim of the prairie. Elias knew what they would do if they found her here. He felt the decision press upon him, heavy as the sky above. Once, long ago, he would have left her. Duty had taught him to follow orders, to look away from what was inconvenient. But duty had also stripped him of everything he loved. Without another word, Elias lifted her into his arms. She did not cry out, though she winced against the pain of her wound. He placed her across the mare, mounted behind her, and rode hard for the settlement before the scouts came near. When they entered the town, the reaction was swift. Mothers pulled their children close. Men stepped into doorways, hands near their belts, watching. A boy dropped a bucket and water splashed across the dirt road, though none bent to clean it. Elias rode past them in silence, his jaw tight, his burden cradled against him. "She don't belong here," someone muttered. "Comanche," another spat, the word carried with disgust. The girl heard them, though she gave no sign of fear. Her eyes were sharp as flint, scanning every face, refusing to lower her gaze. Elias felt their suspicion cling to him like the storm wind itself, and yet he kept on. He had known rejection before, but never had he seen it mirrored so plainly in another's eyes. At the edge of town stood his homestead. Weathered boards leaned against the years. The fence sagged in places, and the barn roof bore scars of storm and neglect. His wife's touch, her flowers, her curtains, had long been swallowed by dust. The place had grown quiet as a grave since she passed. He carried the girl inside. The air smelled of wood smoke long faded, of old timber and silence. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, and the rocking chair by the hearth gave the faintest groan as though stirring from sleep. He laid the girl upon a cot, fetched water from a bucket, and cleaned the dirt from her face. She accepted the cup without a word. Elias lit a fire. The glow painted the room in amber, pushing shadows against the walls. He sat down at last, the rifle propped beside him, and leaned back in the rocker. The chair moved slow, steady, as he studied the girl wrapped in silence on the cot. Grief pressed at him in the firelight, the memory of his wife sitting in that very chair, sewing beneath the glow, humming a tune that had faded from his memory. The house had been haunted by her absence, but now it bore another presence, fragile yet stubborn. The girl's eyes fluttered shut at last. Sleep claimed her, though her fists remained clenched as though she dreamed of resistance. Elias watched, and though his hands were scarred and his heart worn thin, something within him refused to abandon her. The storm broke outside, rain sweeping the prairie, rattling against the window panes. Elias did not move. He listened to the rain, the fire, the slow creak of the chair, and the quiet breathing of the girl. And for the first time in years, his home no longer felt entirely empty. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of silence. Elias worked his land with the slow determination of a man who had nothing left but duty to himself. He rose before the sun, stoked the fire to life, and stepped out into the pale blue chill of morning. His fields were thin and weary, the soil beaten by years of wind and poor rain, yet he tended them with the patience of one who knew that survival required tending even to barren ground. Taya remained near the cabin, watchful and restless. At first she touched nothing, only sat near the window or the hearth, her eyes following Elias like a hawk's, mistrust and weariness locked in her silence. But in time her hands grew restless. She picked up bits of rope left in a corner, twisting and braiding them with practiced ease. She found his wife's old shawl, unraveled in places from moth and neglect, and set herself to threading it back together, stitch by stitch. Elias noticed. Each small act of mending stirred something in him. The shawl had once carried the scent of his wife's hair, the warmth of her shoulders on winter nights. To see it in another's hands was painful, yet there was an odd grace in it too, as if the girl were repairing not only cloth but the frayed edges of memory itself. At night, when the chores were done and the wind rattled the shutters, Elias sat in his rocking chair, pipe cold between his teeth. The fire cast its orange glow upon the walls, and shadows stretched long across the room. His eyes would drift to the cot where Taya lay curled, her breathing shallow, her fists sometimes clenched as though fending off dreams. Those nights brought him back to his own shadows. He saw his wife again, Anna, her soft hands laying out bread on the table, her smile gentle as dawn. He heard her voice, telling him of the child they hoped for, the nursery corner she wished to set near the window where light would fall in the mornings. That dream had ended with fever, swift and merciless, leaving Elias alone with a cradle never built. Other nights, darker still, carried him back to the regiment. The memory of boots pounding earth, rifles cracking, and children's cries ringing through smoke. He remembered the order given without hesitation, the village set aflame, and the sound of women wailing as men fired into the night. Elias had ridden away from that field, his stomach heaving, his soul scarred. The uniform he burned with his own hands, but the smell of that fire clung to him still. He had abandoned the army, abandoned duty, abandoned everything except his grief. And yet, here in his cabin, with a girl who spoke little and trusted less, he felt the past reaching for him. Taya's silence was not emptiness but weight. Some nights she woke with a start, breathing hard, her gaze darting toward the door as though expecting riders to burst through. She muttered words in her tongue, quick and jagged, fragments of visions too heavy for her small frame. Once, in the gray hours before dawn, Elias heard her whisper a single word, broken and trembling, perhaps a name, perhaps a plea. He did not ask. He knew what loss sounded like. By day, the world outside the cabin grew restless. Elias heard voices near his fence when he returned from the fields. Settlers spoke of the girl in low tones, some sharp with fear, others with anger. "She'll bring trouble," one said. "The soldiers'll come looking," another warned. A third, bitter, muttered, "Best to turn her out before they arrive." Elias listened but gave no answer. He carried his tools back inside, shut the door, and barred it. The rocking chair creaked as he sat, rifle across his knees, thumb brushing over the worn wood of its stock. Once, he had pulled the trigger without question. Once, he had been a man of orders. Now, every decision carried the weight of judgment, of dignity either granted or denied. The cabin grew heavy with symbolism that neither spoke aloud. Old tools hung on the wall, rusted but not discarded. A harness sat broken in a corner, leather cracked, awaiting repair that had never come. Empty chairs lined the table, reminders of conversations that would never be spoken again. Yet among these remnants of abandonment, Taya's presence began to stir faint life. Her braids lay across her shoulders like marks of resilience. The shawl she repaired warmed her small frame at night. Sometimes Elias caught her standing at the threshold, face tilted to the wind, as if listening for something beyond the horizon. He wondered if she saw him as protector or jailer, savior or threat. He wondered if she hated the very blood in his veins, for men like him had stolen so much from hers. Yet she stayed. And in her silence, he saw his own reflected, two souls bound not by trust yet, but by the simple truth of survival. One evening, as the sun fell and the sky bled into violet, Elias carried in wood for the fire. He paused at the sight of her sitting by the hearth, shawl across her shoulders, braiding lengths of rope into a pattern that seemed purposeful, almost ceremonial. Her eyes flicked up, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw something soften there. Not trust, not gratitude, but recognition. Elias lowered the wood, fed the fire, and sat in his rocking chair. The shadows danced across the walls. His scars itched as if remembering the blood they had once spilled. Yet for the first time in many years, he wondered if perhaps survival meant more than simply drawing breath. Perhaps survival was found in the act of keeping another alive, of mending what was broken even when the world demanded it be left in ruins. The sky turned black before night had even come. Clouds tumbled low across the prairie, thick and swollen with rain, and the air hung heavy with the sharp scent of ozone. Elias was stacking wood against the cabin wall when the first drops fell, fat and cold. In minutes the storm was upon him, driving sheets of rain across the yard, thunder rolling like cannon fire. He hurried the last of the wood inside and barred the door against the wind. The cabin shuddered beneath each crash of thunder. Firelight wavered, shadows leaping against the walls. Taya crouched near the hearth, her shawl pulled tight, her wide eyes reflecting each flash of lightning that split the sky. The storm was fierce enough to mask the sound at first, but soon a new noise rose above it, a pounding, urgent and deliberate, striking the door. Elias set his jaw. Few came calling in such weather, and none without need. He lifted his rifle, set it close to hand, and pulled the door open against the rain. A man stood there, water streaming from his hat brim, uniform soaked dark with storm. Sergeant Hale. His face was older, more lined, but Elias knew him at once. Once they had ridden side by side in the regiment, brothers in arms. Hale's hand rested on the butt of his revolver, though not yet drawn. Behind him, barely visible through the downpour, stood the blurred figures of mounted men, rain glistening on their rifles. "Well," Hale said, voice half swallowed by the storm, "thought I'd find you out here. You always did like the edge of things." Elias stepped back without a word. Hale entered, dripping water onto the floorboards, his boots heavy with mud. The door shut, muting the roar of the storm but not silencing it. By firelight, the two men regarded each other. Elias took his place in the rocking chair, the rifle still within reach, while Hale stood near the hearth, steam rising from his coat. Taya had slipped into the shadows of the loft ladder, watching from above, her presence hidden but not. "You heard the talk, I reckon," Hale said, pulling a flask from his coat. He drank, then offered it out. Elias did not move. With a shrug, Hale drank again. "Word is, you're keeping company with a Comanche girl. Wounded. Young. Folks are nervous. Command's nervous." The fire popped, spitting sparks. Elias stared into the flames, his face carved with stillness. Hale leaned closer. "You know what it means, Elias. Harboring her makes you no better than them. Orders are clear. We can't risk spies, can't risk raids. You of all men should understand." The storm raged, rattling the shutters, casting wild shadows. Elias's silence filled the room heavier than thunder. He shifted slightly, the rocking chair creaking as it leaned back and forward again. "You were a good soldier once," Hale pressed, voice edged with frustration. "One of the best. Never questioned, never faltered. What happened to that man?" At last Elias spoke, his voice low, rough from disuse. "He died in the fire we lit ourselves." Hale's jaw tightened. For a moment, neither man moved, the lightning flashing white across their faces, Elias marked by scars, Hale by weariness. Taya's eyes followed them from the loft, her small hands gripping the wood. She did not understand all the words, but she understood the danger. The stranger's voice was sharp, the threat clear. Yet Elias did not bow his head, did not hand her over. His silence was not surrender. It was a wall, as strong as stone. Hale broke the quiet with a bitter laugh. He poured whiskey into the fire, and the flames flared high before settling back into steady glow. Always were stubborn. But stubborn don't keep you alive. Think on it, Elias. When this storm breaks, I'll be back, with orders. Don't make me drag you down with her. He turned, heavy boots striking the floor. At the door he paused, rain sweeping in as he opened it. You owe me the courtesy of making the right choice. The storm swallowed him, the door slamming shut behind. Elias sat unmoving, the chair rocking slow, his face lit and shadowed in turns by the fire's glow. Taya crept down from the loft, her bare feet soundless on the steps. She stood by the hearth, shawl wrapped close, her dark eyes fixed on him. She said nothing, but the question in her gaze was plain, would he give her up? Elias met her eyes at last. In his silence she found her answer. His loyalty was no longer to flag or regiment. It was to something older, carved deep by sorrow and loss, justice, however fragile, however dangerous. Outside, thunder rolled away across the plains. The storm was breaking. But within the cabin, the choice had already been made. The days after Hale's visit carried a weight heavier than the storm he left behind. The air itself seemed to wait, as though the prairie held its breath. Elias moved through his chores with quiet purpose, every task sharpened by the knowledge that men were coming. He repaired broken hinges, sharpened the edge of his axe, patched the sagging fence along the north side of the yard. Each act might have seemed ordinary, but beneath his steady hands lay preparation. Taya sensed it too. She followed his rhythm in silence, carrying wood, fetching water, tending the small fire that never seemed to die. Her movements were sharp, restless. She braided her hair tight each morning, her fingers quick, the plaits pulled so firm they seemed like armor. She sat with her back straight, shoulders square, as though ready to rise and flee, or fight, at a moment's notice. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fire burned low, the silence between them softened into something different. One night Elias spoke of Anna, his wife. His voice cracked at first, as if the words had grown brittle from disuse. He told of the shawl, how she had woven it during their first winter, how she had worn it when the fever took her. He did not speak long, but each word seemed pulled from deep within. Taya listened, her dark eyes steady. Later, she lifted her hand toward the window where the stars burned sharp above the prairie. In her tongue she whispered names, pointing to each cluster of light, the hunter, the river, the grandmother's fire. Elias understood little of the words, but he knew their meaning, family, memory, belonging. He sat in the rocking chair, pipe cold between his teeth, and let her voice weave threads of sound into the silence. The trust that grew between them was not swift nor easy. It was tender, like a plant pushing through dry earth. They did not smile, did not touch. Yet something passed between them in each glance, in the shared silence of meals, in the long hours spent working side by side. It was not the fire of passion, but the ember of recognition, two abandoned souls who had found, however briefly, a reason not to be alone. But outside the cabin, unrest thickened. Elias heard it in the voices near his fence when he walked back from the fields. Settlers muttered louder now, no longer content to whisper. He caught phrases in the wind, burn him out, soldiers coming, she'll bring death to us all. At the general store, men glanced away when he entered, their hands twitching toward their belts. A woman spat in the dirt near his boots. The air was sour with judgment, as if the town itself were turning against him. Rumors of soldiers marching closer drifted in with each passing rider. Some claimed they were a day's ride away. Others swore Hale's patrol had already spoken of Elias by name. Fear thickened into anger, and anger turned toward his lonely cabin. That night, Elias sat in the rocking chair, the fire's glow warm against his face. The chair creaked slow, steady, counting the moments as if marking the passage of time until the soldiers arrived. Taya sat on the cot, the shawl around her shoulders, her braids loosened by the day's wear. Her eyes never left him. "You'll not be safe here," Elias said at last. His voice was low, gravel-worn. "When they come, they won't ask questions." She tilted her head, silent as always. She did not flee. Instead, she pulled the shawl tighter, as though to root herself deeper. Elias studied her, and in her defiance, he felt his own resolve harden. The cabin became both refuge and prison. Every sound outside set Elias's hand toward his rifle. The groan of the wind against the shutters, the bark of a coyote in the distance, even the sigh of rain dripping from the eaves, all were warnings. The firelight seemed sharper, the shadows darker, the rocking chair louder. Each creak was no longer the rhythm of comfort, but the countdown of inevitability. Yet amid the dread, Elias felt a strange calm. He had run from battles before, abandoned uniforms, left graves behind. But this choice, though it might bring ruin, felt different. It was not born of duty to command or fear of shame, it was born of something older. One evening, as dusk bled across the horizon, Elias stepped outside. The sky burned orange, the air cool and sharp with the promise of autumn. He leaned on the fence he had mended, staring out at the endless grass. For a moment he thought of Anna, of the child they never held, of the life that had slipped through his hands. The prairie wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the town, and it struck him that the world would always whisper its judgments. But here, in this yard, he had chosen to stand. When he turned back, Taya stood in the doorway, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her braids catching the last light of day. She looked at him not with fear, nor with gratitude, but with something steadier, a recognition that he would not turn her away, not even if it cost him everything. Elias nodded once, a gesture small but final. The bond between them did not need words. It was stitched from silence, from grief, from the simple truth of two lives abandoned by the world yet refusing to abandon each other. The sun dipped. The night crept in. And with it came the knowledge that soon, very soon, the soldiers would arrive. The dawn came dim, heavy with mist. The prairie lay hushed, the grasses bending under a slow drizzle, the air sharp with the smell of wet earth. Elias had been awake through the night, sitting in his rocking chair, rifle propped against his knee. He knew the hour would come, and when the glow broke on the horizon, he rose to meet it. At first it seemed the rising sun. But the light was too red, too fierce, too low to the ground. Torches. They came in a line, soldiers on horseback, their silhouettes black against the morning fog. At their head rode Sergeant Hale, his coat buttoned high, his hat dripping with rain. The torches hissed as the drizzle fell harder, but their glow held steady. Behind them came a knot of settlers, drawn like moths to flame, eager to witness, or perhaps to join, the reckoning. Elias stepped out onto the yard, rifle in hand. His boots sank into the wet earth, but his stance was steady. The barn loomed behind him, the cabin quiet at his back. He did not glance toward it, though he knew Taya would be watching from the doorway. Hale raised a hand, and the patrol halted. Horses stamped and blew steam into the damp air. For a moment, only the rain spoke. Then Hale's voice cut through, sharp as steel. "Elias. You know why we're here. Give us the girl, and we'll be gone before the day's half over." Elias shifted the rifle across his chest. His voice was low, but steady. "She's under my protection. I've seen too many children dragged to slaughter. Not again." Murmurs stirred among the settlers. Some nodded, grim-faced. Others spat into the mud. Hale's jaw worked as though chewing a bitter root. "You think you can stand against us?" he asked. "You think you can change the tide with one rifle?" Elias said nothing. He only stood, rain running down his weathered face, the rifle gripped in his scarred hands. His silence was answer enough. The standoff grew taut. The rain fell heavier, hissing against the torches, soaking rifles, darkening coats. Hale tried persuasion first, his words turning from warning to reason to promise of mercy. But when Elias remained unmoved, Hale's tone hardened into threat. You'll bring ruin on yourself. On this land. On everything you've tried to keep. Don't be a fool, Elias. Hand her over. From the cabin doorway, Taya stepped into view. The shawl wrapped around her shoulders clung dark with rain, its threads gleaming like old silver in the torchlight. Her braids hung heavy down her chest, her chin lifted, her gaze unflinching. She looked not like a child cowering from fate, but like a figure claimed by belonging, Elias's wife's shawl upon her, the cabin at her back, the fire of her people in her eyes. The sight of her stirred the crowd. Some gasped. Some cursed. One man called for her to be seized. Then the silence broke. A shot cracked, sharp against the rain. The horses reared, the settlers cried out. A torch slipped, spinning through the air, landing against the barn wall. At once the dry timber caught. Flames spread hungrily, smoke curling black into the sky, twisting like ghosts rising from the graves of all Elias had lost. Elias raised his rifle. His shot was not aimed to kill, but to warn. The report thundered across the valley, echoing off the hills, louder than the storm itself. The soldiers froze. The settlers faltered. In that instant, the weight of his defiance filled the air like the crack of judgment. The barn roared higher, flames licking into the morning. Sparks whirled on the wind, glowing embers drifting like fireflies across the wet prairie. Smoke wrapped around Elias, stinging his eyes, clawing at his throat. Yet he stood unshaken, the rifle steady, the fire behind him both ruin and shield. Settlers drawn by the shot hurried from town, gathering at the edges of the yard. Their faces were split, some twisted in anger, demanding Elias be cast down, others tight with sympathy, unwilling to watch another child torn away. The division cut through them like the very line of fire burning across the barn. Hale sat astride his horse, water dripping from his brim, eyes locked on Elias. For a long moment, neither moved. Their gazes held across the smoke and rain, across the memory of wars fought side by side. Hale's hand rested near his revolver, but he did not draw. You can't win this, he said at last, voice low. Elias's voice answered, rough but firm. It's not about winning. It's about giving her a chance. The barn collapsed inward, sparks leaping high. Settlers cried out, shielding their faces. Horses stamped nervously, their riders pulling at reins. The air was chaos, rain, fire, shouting, but at its center Elias remained still, a lone figure against the blaze, refusing to bend. In that smoke, Elias felt the truth settle in his chest. Protection was not only defiance. It was not simply standing with a rifle and saying no. It was giving dignity where the world sought to strip it away. It was carrying a burden so that another might walk unbroken. Taya's eyes met his from the cabin threshold. She clutched the shawl tight, not as a child clings to comfort, but as one claims a banner. In her gaze was not fear, but something stronger, belief. The storm of men and fire had come, and still Elias stood. Morning broke pale and hollow, a sky drained of color, its silence pierced only by the slow crackle of dying embers. The barn was gone, its frame collapsed into smoldering ash, black smoke trailing faint into the gray heavens. The yard was littered with prints, mud churned by boots and hooves, the earth itself scarred by conflict. But the house still stood, silent, weather-beaten, stubborn as the man who had defended it. The soldiers had gone with the dawn. They had not broken Elias, nor had they claimed the girl. Under the watchful eyes of the settlers, and under the weight of their own hesitation, they had turned their horses toward the horizon. Hale had been the last to leave. He sat tall in his saddle, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, gaze steady on Elias. No words were spoken. Only a long look, half warning, half something else, something nearer to respect. Then he, too, disappeared into the mist. Elias stood alone in the wet yard, rifle heavy in his hands. For a long while he did not move. The rain softened to a drizzle, the earth steaming where flame and water had warred. He felt the ache in his bones, in his scarred hands, in the memory of all he had lost. Yet beneath the ache was stillness, a strange quiet that had not lived in him for many years. When at last he entered the cabin, he found Taya sitting where the fire's glow lingered. The shawl was around her shoulders, its thread still faint with the scent of the woman who once wore it. She looked up at him, her eyes rimmed with smoke and sleeplessness, but steady. He set the rifle across the table. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. "This belongs to you now." She did not reach for it, not at once. Instead, her fingers tightened on the shawl, drawing it close. Then, with the slowness of ritual, she touched the rifle's worn stock, as though acknowledging more than a weapon, acknowledging the burden it carried, and the trust laid within it. Elias nodded once, a gesture of finality. The gift was not meant to bind her to him, but to free her. By mid-morning, the horse was saddled. The sky lightened, clouds lifting in tatters, and the land stretched wide and damp, breathing after storm and fire. Taya mounted behind him, silent, her hands resting lightly at his sides. He did not speak, and neither did she. Words were too small for what they carried. They rode away from the settlement, past fields blackened with smoke, past fences still standing though crooked with age. A few settlers watched from doorways, faces unreadable. Some eyes held reproach, others pity, a few a glimmer of quiet acknowledgement. Elias did not meet their gazes. He had no need. His course was set. The prairie opened before them, vast and unbroken, the grass wet and shining under the cautious sun. Each hoofbeat was a drum of farewell, steady, solemn, unhurried. The sound carried like a prayer, whispered not in words but in rhythm, a benediction offered to the earth itself. The ride was long. Hills rose and fell, rivers swollen from the storm lay in their path, and still they pressed on. Taya remained silent, but Elias could feel her strength in the way she sat, in the way her gaze never faltered from the horizon. She was not being led to fate, she was walking into it with her own steps, her own will. At last, as evening neared, the land shifted. Smoke curled from distant fires, thin columns rising from the valley beyond the ridge. Shapes moved along the ridgeline, riders, watchful, poised. The Comanche camp spread below, tents scattered like pale stones along the riverbank. Elias reined in the horse at the crest. The riders approached, slow, deliberate. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes sharp with suspicion. The air between them was taut as a bowstring. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Taya slid from the saddle. Her braids had loosened in the wind, strands falling free. She wrapped the shawl tight around her shoulders, the rifle balanced carefully in her grasp. She did not look back at Elias. She stepped forward, her figure small but unyielding against the vastness of the plain. The riders parted for her. Their eyes shifted from Elias to the girl, recognition dawning. One dismounted, reaching out to her in silence. And Taya went to them, not as one returned in weakness, but as one who had endured. Elias sat his horse, watching until the shadows of the camp enfolded her. Only then did he turn his mount away. The ride home was slower, emptier. The weight behind him was gone, but it left not hollowness, rather a strange lightness, as though something had been carried across a threshold and set down in its rightful place. When he reached his cabin, night had gathered. The barn lay in ash, the house in shadow. He entered, hung the rifle on its peg, and sat once more in the rocking chair. The floorboards creaked, the wind whispered through the eaves. But the silence was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a man who had chosen. The chair rocked steady, bearing not only grief, but also a measure of peace. He had protected. He had let go. He had given dignity where once there was only rejection. And though the fire had burned low, though the room was dim, Elias Kincaid sat as one who had found his reckoning, not in victory, but in the quiet strength of release.